and well watered.
Yes.
I have the privilege of introducing the next two speakers, B.U.Ara Sarafian and Ari Sarafian. I will just give a very brief description of who they are and what they do, but I think that as their topics are most interesting, I'd let them do the talking rather than me. B.U.Ara Sarafian is from she's the director of the Communist Institute in London and has written about a book on Talat Pasha's report on the Armenian genocide. He's been working recently, which I think very similar to Professor Matusyan, focusing attention on the destruction of the Armenian community in Karpat, in Turkish Harput. And it's almost, I think, a memorial excavation of the architecture and the ruins of that city, which I think will be most interesting. So I'll leave it to
Thank you.
to
First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak to you. I'm particularly happy that the Turkish community is supporting this event. That shows that how times have changed. These distinctions between Armenian, Turks and Kurds are being blurred, as they should be, because we have a common history where there is need for critical analysis and reevaluation, not just on the Turkish side of the calculation, but also on the Armenian side. And that's something we can touch on later. When I was at Professor Dildilian, when I was listening to Professor Mashubian's presentation, it's remarkable that how similar our work is, our approach is, even though we worked independently of each other. That includes engaging Turkish audiences. As it happens, I met him in Diyarbakir when he was in his exhibition, as a matter of course. So again, these are all positive developments in these Turkish-Armenian issues. When I put my paper together, I made some notes. The whole question of definition of the Armenian genocide, of course, comes. I didn't anticipate what our first speaker would say. Much more sympathetic approach. I get the definition issue all the time. I'm a historian by training. I work with deniers, so that's a big difference between myself and Dr. Mashubian. I engage deniers at an academic level, and I need to be much more precise in some ways and even crude when we're dealing with these issues. I myself prefer to use the word mezyeren to describe the fate of Armenia in 1915, the way people use the word Shoah, because that represents a totality of a human experience that I feel that we can only sort of chip away at as academics. I, as a historian, somebody could be a psychoanalyst, somebody else could be a theologian, philosopher, a lawyer. We all look at different aspects of a horrendous experience for which, in many ways, we don't have the language to begin to understand. Again, it's very similar to how people had to deal with the experience of what Nazi Germany's legacy after 1945. Regarding the Armenian genocide, so when I'm prodded by deniers, so what do you mean by genocide? I said my starting point is similar to what this morning. It's about the mass annihilation of a people because of who they are in the under the auspices of the state. That's another element I add to it, because that actually characterizes what happened to Armenians. So, but of course we can be even narrower than that. So it's a purposeful destruction. In the case of Armenians, the Armenians like to say the first genocide, of the modern era. I feel uncomfortable, but it's an interesting concept because the Armenian genocide was a modern genocide in the way it was implemented, in the way technology was used, modern communications, telegraphs, bureaucracies to identify victims, to corral them into the genocidal process. In the case of Harper, you'll see section by section, name by name, with some people exempted, as in the case of Marzofan, because the state needed their services. In many ways, it's a modern genocide, Also, the telegraphic system meant that there was near real-time annihilation. That means the state was actually part and parcel of destruction process in the provinces from Constantinople. One of the defining elements of the Armenian genocide is that it's a genocide that's denied. That is a defining, that's what makes it so different, say, than the Holocaust. Because there is a state, starting from 100 years ago until today, even today, there is a state that purposely tries to obscure it as something other than what it was. So even 1915, it was presented as a deportation program, Armenians were rebels, this whole idea of threat, for which I would argue the evidence does not support that, even threat argumentation that's come out in recent years. And to justify the vilification and also the systematic so-called deportation and destruction of these people. Excuse me. And it's not just telegraphy, I also include judiciary. Laws were enacted in order to give direction to the whole process, to make it legal to kill Armenians. Laws were enacted in the case of conversions, that there was a process of conversion. You could abduct Armenian children. There was a whole process of changing names, religion, issuing new identity papers. So that's a major distinction in the Holocaust that we touched on before. Conversion is a major part of the Armenian genocide. We can see that all over the place. In one of my works, I estimated that about 10% of Armenians converted this time. Not the way your family did, but invariably would be children and young women who will be absorbed into male society, patriarchal society, where they will be required to lose their identity and raise good Muslim, Turkish or Kurdish children. Today we can see the remnants of these people. So many people said my grandmother was Armenian. This is a phenomenon in itself. And in Diyarbakir, once it was Easter time, there were 1,400 people at church. Half of them were Muslims, Muslim background. So it's a major phenomenon within Turkey itself. But again, it's only coming to the fore in recent years. Okay. When I start my presentation of the Armenian genocide, first of all, this is where modern-day Armenian state is in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. On even 1915, this would have been a distribution of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. When we talk about the destruction of Armenians, this is what we're talking about. Marzafan is up here, we heard about. Now we're going to talk about Kharkiv in the center of what is now Turkey. This is historic Western Armenia, Cilicia, Constantinople, the largest Armenian center within the Ottoman Empire. The Armenians were integrated element of the Ottoman Empire. They inhabited in approximately over 2,400 communities. So when we talk about genocide process, we are talking about the destruction of 2,000 individual communities, one by one. And as I'll talk later, that was a process that the state organized from the center. And we have many of the telegrams ordering such deportations classified in Turkish archives. Turkish archives are a fascinating phenomenon because they're part of a denialist exercise too. Modern Turkish archives try to reflect the position of the state in terms of declassifying deportation records, but no resettlement records. Ostensibly, Armenians were resettled in the Deir Zor area. In Turkish archives, you will not find records showing that anything of that order of Armenians were settled there, and I will touch on that later. But we can see that the Ottoman state, Talat Pasha, was personally ordering deportation of Armenians. He was issuing follow-up questions. How many of this convoy reached such and such place? He was conducting surveys of Armenians during the deportation process. This whole idea of assimilating these Armenians, as the 5% figure came up, that was the case. Directives were sent out that not only would Armenians be required to convert, those who were allowed to live, but they would have to be distributed amongst Muslim Muslim villages for assimilation. So, for example, in Kayseri, out of 48,000 Armenians, 6,000 remained behind, and there were orders going out that they would have to be distributed amongst Muslim villages, even a requirement that they would have to intermarry with Muslim men invariably, but even so there was some question about women as well. Assimilation was an integral element of the genocidal process in Turkey. why was that the case? And why was it genocide? I would argue because Armenians could not be assimilated as a community. They were far too advanced, as you could see. They were the merchant class, they were the artisan class, they were very well to do compared to their Muslim neighbors. They had their distinct identity as Christians, mainly apostolic but Protestant Catholics. They had their own press, their own newspapers. It's very difficult to assimilate Armenians in that context, as opposed to Kurds, who were relatively illiterate. So the process that we see in Republican Turkey was assimilation of Muslims. Very difficult to assimilate these advanced Armenian and Greek as well communities. So I would argue, we can touch on that, but nation building, and Armenians were not required for that process. It had nothing to do with what Armenians did, it had to do with the ideology of a state. The modern Turkish revolution, the Turkish Republic, as people often see as a watershed, started in 1912. After 1213, after the Balkan Wars, the Committee of Union Progress were Turkish nationalists. They had a nationalist agenda, and that was a systematic Turkification. And that entailed physically destroying Armenians, but also liquidating their properties in the service of resettling Muslims, who would then become this modern Turkish nation. So, for example, liquidation of Armenian properties was also regulated by the state to make sure that it didn't fall into the hands of individuals. A lot of it did, but for the most part, it was a Turkish state that tried to liquidate physically people for its own purposes. Now, one of the most, I think, important, because while Turkish archives are problematic because they're not there necessarily to inform, but they're very useful. There are also Turkish records that we have access to that have not been subject to the censorship regime of the Turkish archives itself. Talat Pasha, the Young Turk leader in charge of the destruction of Armenians, was assassinated in Berlin, 1921. His private papers remained with his own family, and so they didn't enter the Turkish archives. And his family released this to a Turkish journalist who subsequently published that material, 2005. We don't need to get into the details, but you can ask the question and answer session. He published Talat Pasha's remaining papers, as he called it, which included a report on the Armenian genocide. This is the title I give to the report because the original has no title on it. And as I looked into it, you realize in February 1917, Talat Pasha ordered a survey of Armenians. Again, the survey gives you a sense of what kind of control the state has over its own victims. He asked a very simple question. How many Armenians are there in your province? How many of them are they local, and how many of them are outsiders? Those who are outsiders, where do they come from? So if in Aleppo, if there are 5,000 Armenians who are not from Aleppo, where do they come from? It would be Sivas, Yozgat, so forth. And that information was subsequently used. Those survey reports are only available to us in piecemeal fashion, and they don't cover many of the key areas, like Deir Zor. I'd like to know how many Armenians there were in Deir Zor in 1917, because our records will show less than 10,000. Practically zero. And at the beginning of the report is a synopsis. And in the synopsis, there is a column that says, the provinces are listed here, it goes left to right. What was the Armenian population in 1914? In that same province, in 1917, how many of them are outside Armenians? How many of these Armenians here in 1914 are in other provinces of the Ottoman Empire? And from that information, you actually can work out how many Armenians were there in the Ottoman Empire according to what provinces. So what I've done is I made a map out of it. This is a map of how Talat Pasha saw Armenians in the Ottoman Empire in 1917. The red line is where the survey was conducted, including the so-called resettlement zone. It was not conducted in the eastern province, including the Harput area, and there's a very good reason for that, because technically there were no Armenians left there by 1917. Already in 1916, there are reports coming to Talat Pasha saying all the Armenians and I've seen for Trabzon, Harput, Memorial Aziz, and Diyarbakir, they've all been deported except for remnants. So effectively, you realize that in the east is a very different regime. But the question was asked in all these areas, including the so-called resettlement zone. The size of the circle represents how many Armenians were there according to official Turkish figures, Ottoman figures in 1914. This is a distribution of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire in 1914 according to Ottoman data. The black areas represent the number of people from that province who could not be counted anywhere in this area. So these number of people who disappeared between 1914 and 1917. Armenians counted. Okay. The red is the number of Armenians who were counted in other provinces, so it will be in this area, and we know where they were counted. And the blue are the ones who remain behind. So already you realize that, because I engaged Turkish historiography, I was making this point. In the eastern provinces, there was war going on. There are all kinds of reasons why Armenians will be missing. Many, of course, escaped to Russia. But it also shows you that the number of Armenians who simply went missing in areas like Izmit and Bursa, Eskişehir, Ankara. The death rates are phenomenal because, I'm calling it death rates, the missing number of people is phenomenal because it's like over 3/4 in these western provinces. And this, of course, corresponds to our understanding of the Armenian genocide based on other sources, such as the ones that we're talking today. This material is based completely on Ottoman records, including the original survey returns. As I mentioned, in the original 1917 survey, 1917 survey, it included data for Deir Zor. I haven't actually said where they ended up. You can make another one showing where these people ended up. In the Deir Zor area, where even today Turkish historians will say 400,000 to 500,000 Armenians were sent there. In 1917, 6,700 people were counted there. Syria had a very large Armenian, many survived in the Syria area. Mosul would be the other place here, resettlement zone. I have to figure it out. 7,300. So in the main deportation areas where Armenians were supposed to settle, including Armenians from Harpert, there were practically speaking no Armenians left there. In fact, according to this data, the number of Armenians from Harpert on this map would be 2,200. That is according to Ottoman data, from 70,000 people. So, unless they escaped east, and very few did escape, the vast majority of Armenians were slaughtered, and this argumentation is made entirely on the basis of Ottoman records. I work on this because my purpose is, I will not change the minds of deniers, but my purpose is to engage Turkish audiences to be more critical with their own material, because Turkish archival sources do not support the official Turkish position, and quite the opposite. If you were to look at it critically, the material actually supports the genocide thesis. So this is part of the work that I do. So, Armenian Harpert, so that little dot in the middle of modern-day Turkey. This is the Harpert plain. This is based on the 1913 census carried out by the Armenian Patriarchate. It shows where Armenian populations were, the distribution of villages with Armenian communities in them. Purely Muslim villages would not be on this because they had nothing to do with the Patriarchate. So this is where Harpert is, Mezre, and Husseini. The red is where Armenians were. So at the center of the Harpert plain, Armenians were actually pretty much half the population. And every single one of these communities, the green ones are Protestant, the purple are Catholic. This is the distribution of Armenians. The scale is what? About 10 miles, so we're talking kilometers, sorry. So we're talking about 50 and 60 kilometers, which meant that if you were based in Harpert, you could go anywhere on this plain you want within a matter of one day. That's an important part of my presentation. Harpert itself and Mezre were major centers, and this comes with my paper, were major centers in a sense of recording the Armenian genocide, because Mezre, the capital of the province, was included in an American consulate. So the American consul Davis was based there, which meant that Davis played a critical role during the genocide in communicating with the outside world. Unlike the case of Marzafan or Sivas, which had even Americans living there, they could not communicate directly with the outside world. In fact, in the case of Marzafan, I believe it's a missionary by the name of Compton who made a journey all the way to Constantinople to report what was going on to Armenians. But in the case of Harpet, they had access to communication. And other than the American consulate there, Harpet was a major missionary center for Armenians, for Americans, American Protestants, for Catholics, the Capuchin monastery there, German missionaries, Danish missionaries, and several other nationalities. So we have a rich source of information on what happened in this one region. Because these people reported what was going on to the American embassy, in the case of Davis. They reported the Bible House in Constantinople, the missionary center. They reported to the American missionary center in Boston, as well as keeping diaries. So we have diaries of these missionaries on a daily basis, one of which we publish. It's a Danish missionary. The fact that it's a Danish missionary also makes it interesting because they're all different sources. They're independent of each other. So we have a plethora of sources. I sat down and I said, well, how much material am I using in terms of informant? I was using about 9 foreign citizens in reporting what was happening within a short space of 2 months on a daily basis in terms of their reports and diary entries like Atkinson, plus the American consul reports. So we have a microcosm of the Armenian genocide that pretty much does not support a Turkish census, as I said, but paints a picture of the systematic annihilation of Armenians pretty much as we know it today, in a broad sense. There are always exceptions. There were always Turks and Kurds who acted against the state, who saved people, but by and large, the Armenian population of this entire area was destroyed within a matter of two months. So already in May, until May, the records show that the relation between different groups was normal. It was wartime. They had all kinds of difficulties, but there's no indication any kind of ethnic strife. It's mobilization. Some people are let's say, they're running away from the armed forces, whether it's Armenians or Kurds, but pretty much it's normal. In May, you already see the vilification of Armenians. The normal question is, what did the Armenians do? Well, that is the wrong question, because you don't see any evidence of what they did do. But you can see how they were being vilified. They were being accused of being a treacherous minority. There are mass arrests of individual Armenian men, including many of them who worked in American colleges, so people very well known to the missionaries. And again, in a descriptive way, they were released. But already in May, at the end of May, you have the arrival of Armenian soldiers who had been disarmed. They were kept in the village of Hova. About 1,200 of them, they brought to the Red Konak prison, which the missionaries and Armenian sources describe, and they were taken away and disappeared. Rumors, it's always rumors that they were killed, because the Americans really didn't see actual killings. They couldn't see actual killings because the state tried to cover it up. And already by the beginning of July, you had the first convoys of the men being separated from the city. The first convoy was 800 men, the leaders of the Armenian communities, the professors of the colleges, and they were taken away and killed. We know they were killed because the Americans ran hospitals. Some of the survivors made their own way back. One famous one is by the name of Melkon Nulejan, who gives a very vivid description of how those killings took place. 2 days after the event itself, the Americans already had an idea of what was going on. And in the meantime, you realize what was the position of Armenians? Were they guilty? Were the Armenian Church, that's apostolic, the Protestants, including the German Protestant leader, they went around the villages, and the typical response of Armenians here and other places too, Sivas was another one, was to not to argue with the authorities, but to bow way, to give way, to don't make any fuss. So when the state accused Armenians of armed searches, the rule was that you should surrender any kind of weapon you have. This was a typical response of the Armenian establishment. It is to go with the state, don't challenge them. There were some cases of firefights, fighting between some Armenians. We're talking about 3 or 4 incidents. For the most part, there are people who had run away from the army, who were cornered, and they killed a few gendarmes. That's the extent of the fighting. The Armenians within Harpet were taken away and murdered within a matter, in fact, the civil population within a matter of a few weeks. Now, the Americans had a pretty good idea what would happen to them, because at the same time, Harpet was an area through which other convoys would start arriving from further north. So at the same time, you had convoys arriving from Erzurum, And there are harrowing descriptions of the condition. There are no men in these convoys, they're emaciated, there are descriptions that they look like skeletons because they have been fed and malnourished. I might read you some passages. And then they had another 600 kilometers to go. Effectively, it was a death sentence. And the Americans already had a sense of what was going on. Soon afterwards, you had women escaping from the villages, women who had been abducted by Kurdish men, coming back once more and reporting what's happening in Koilu and a certain number of villages. So the Americans had real information from the victims themselves, which they were communicating to the outside world. To the outside world. And in final analysis, the American consul, Davis, and Reverend Atkinson, one of the missionaries, actually went to the killing areas. So they had heard rumors that the killings were taking place, not just people by the roadside. And they described two trips that they made to the Kezin Khan area and to this area around Lake Geljuk. So we know when those trips took place. They are mentioned by a number of these sources. And we have very detailed descriptions of tens of thousands of corpses. So Davis describes physically going, you can follow an ordinary survey map, the valleys in which people were taken by the gendarmes, where they will be corralled, both ends will be with clothes, and then they will be murdered. Sometimes the killing took place with extra, with local Kurds that they use, and sometimes will be killed by the gendarmes themselves. So we have first-hand evidence of the killing that was taking place even while the genocidal process was going on. And in fact, Harper played a key role in the United States in 1915 in starting a humanitarian intervention program within the Ottoman Empire. Already by July, Ambassador Morgenthau was saying a campaign of race extermination is taking place under pretense of opposing an Armenian uprising. By October, the Americans were already publicizing these reports to the American press in order to raise funds, in order to save the victims where they can. So the missionary structure was used to try and reach the remnants of these killings. And so this is part of the historical record, and Harpert lends itself to a critical analysis. To this day, this is a challenge I made a few years ago to Turkish historians. I said, why don't we use Harpert as a case study? Because we have good information from a number of sources. The obvious question is what happened to the population here? If they were resettled, where were they resettled? Because one of the things that you realize, as they were being deported, these people were being registered. That's also recorded by the sources at hand. So victims are chosen by name, by quarter, but also when they were taken away, their property was registered as well as their name. So the state did keep records of its own victims, supposedly that they would be compensated at the places of resettlement. If I may, do I have time? Just to give you a few ideas. Monsignor Israelian, he was a Catholic leader, because these are individual cases of massacre. So he was sent out after the main part of Armenians, latter part of July, when most Armenians had already been taken away. The Catholic Armenians made special arrangements for a party of 40 people to be taken away. They had planned to start several times before, but pretended to. The Vali warned them not to do so, saying the roads were not safe, and he wished them to go in safety. So they were delayed. The deportation was delayed. Often there was a way of fleecing them for money, by the way, but you would not see it in a source like this. Among them, the Catholic Armenian Catholic Monsignor Israelian and his associate. And the source then goes on saying, on arriving in Kezin Khan, they found that the Khan was full of gendarmes who told them the road in that direction was not safe and they must go another way. This was probably prearranged. They went back a short distance and were then made to get out of their wagons by the gendarmes and Kurds who had been waiting for them. Their hands were tied and they were taken a few feet back from the road. The Archbishop and his companions attempted to sing hymns, but the books were kicked out of their hands by the gendarmes with curses. All of the party, except 3 women and 2 or 3 children, were then murdered. Mademoiselle Gamat, which is a nun, was amongst who were killed. Now, then it goes into about 3 women who survived. The information of this particular massacre was given by one of these women who was taken by a Kurdish chief who, I guess he was married to him and bore a child. A year later, she escaped. So this particular massacre we know about because one survivor came to the missionaries. And this is the quality of records we have. We have the Khoilu and individuals who escaped from massacres. And then you go to the death camps, as Americans visited the other deportees. As one walks to the camps, mothers held their children, begging visitors to take them and care for them or trying to sell them for a few piastres. Many Turkish officers and other Turks visited the camps to select the prettiest girls and had doctors present to examine them. I afterwards had occasion to try to help a little girl about 12 or 13 years of age by the name of Siranush Holgarogyan, who had come with a party from Erzincan. My uncle in New York, Mr. Rahat Holgarogyan, whom I know the descendants by the way, sent a communication to me through the department and the embassy asking me to protect her and saying that he would send funds for her. After considerable search, my Kabazas found her living with a Turkish officer. She came to the consulate and told me to inform her uncle that she was all right and needed no money. She was well developed for her age and was comparably good-looking girl, but was beginning to show the marks of the life she was living. Young as she was, we noticed that she appeared to be pregnant. 2 months later, she had a child. This is the sort of information that you have, and of course, as they visit these parties, they visit parties from Erzurum, Çarşamba, from Trabzon. This is the quality of records that we have in American archives, alternative sources, which do not support the official Turkish thesis, shall we say, but certainly support the Armenian genocide thesis. And last picture, Harper, this is where the American missionary compound was, theological school, medical school, girls' school, boys' school. That's a Subhagop church. That's what you have today. There's literally nothing remaining there. It's been completely erased. Harput has been reinvented for Turkish tourists, yet out of 5 Armenian churches, none have been there's not even a let alone putting a signpost. There's absolutely nothing there. There's a small Syrian church on the edge of town, tokenistically is there. It's as if Armenians never existed. This is part of the genocidal process. The idea is to erase the memory of Armenians. Thank you.